Well, hi, everyone, and welcome again to the musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
He almost forgot who he was there for a second. But he's
Yes. Wait a minute. Let me think. John Timpane.
Yeah, John Timpane. Just look in your underwear, John.
Okay.
I told him to do that once, and he said he was Fruit of the Loom. So anyway, we have a very special guest today. Kristen Graham is our guest. She's a longtime reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and back in 2012, she was part of an Inquirer team whose series on violence in the schools won the Pulitzer Prize for public service. She's also an all-around wonderful person, and John knows this for a fact. So welcome, Kristen, and nice to have you on the Innertube today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kristen, first of all, I think the question that is burning on all of our minds is, will the Phillies play this year? Will we have baseball? Will our beloved heroes take the field?
I am getting increasingly worried. I think, if it's mid-June and we have no announcement of a season, I am very worried that I'm going to be watching replays of the 2008 World Series for the foreseeable future.
I hope we have some baseball. It's the one thing, to tell you the truth, I'm really missing.
I agree. And I have a 7-year-old baseball fanatic who keeps asking me, did they sign a deal, Mom? Did they sign a deal? So hoping for both of our sakes and yours too, that we get back to playing.
Beautiful. So, Kristen, the reason we're having you on today, besides the fact that we really wanted to have you on in general, I think, is because recently you actually went out on the street to cover the demonstrations in Philadelphia. And we were thinking about, she's an eyewitness. She wrote about it. Let's have her on. Let's talk to her. So let me start by asking you, you're a spouse, you're a mommy, you've got a home life and everything, and yet you volunteer to go cover the demonstrations. That sounds heroic to me. I'd love to hear your thought process about that.
So I am an education reporter, and so typically not involved in breaking news coverage. But, editors had asked for volunteers, and I felt pretty strongly that, that history was being made, and I wanted to be a witness to that. And so, kind of raised my hand, obviously made sure childcare arrangements were set. My husband was
Right.
able to keep the home fires burning. And so went out for a couple of protests. And I guess the second protest that I covered, was one where things got really lively.
Lively in what sense? What happened?
I started out, was assigned by an editor to go and cover a protest that had been happening. This was, kind of after the first weekend of protests in Philadelphia. And, the protesters were starting outside police headquarters at 8th and Race in Philadelphia. So I stayed there. It was quite peaceful. It was kind of this really interesting scene because you have this line of police officers in front of the headquarters, very
Right.
impassive in riot gear, and then, hundreds of protesters who are, talking about systemic injustice and years of discord. And so once this peaceful protest was over, it seemed like every time I looked up to look at the crowd that there were, hundreds more people.
Right.
The protest starts moving. So it moves from, this part sort of at the edge of Chinatown in Center City, through Center City, Philadelphia to Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which is a huge place in Center City, and it starts to go on to 676, so the interstate. And at this point, there are thousands of people there. Lots of police presence. It was hot. The crowd was largely young, but diverse in terms of race. And at some point, certainly there was lots of chanting. Lots of people would pass police officers and scream things like "No good cops in a racist system."
Right.
And suddenly, I guess I'm towards the front, but not at the leading edge. And suddenly, tear gas is fired. I get kind of a little bit of that. And so, it was choking and teary. I did not take a full face of it as some of the protesters did, but I was prepared and had brought along with me, a solution of milk and water that other journalists who had covered protests in the prior days had warned me to bring. I was wearing a helmet at my editor's insistence. And so, I kind of flushed my face with the solution and just kept on reporting for another couple of hours when everything had sort of died down, at that point, there was still a curfew in Philadelphia of 6 o'clock. Police were telling people to leave and, talk to my editor. My editor said, that's fine. Thanks for what you did. You're free to go. So I walked back from, the scene at on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, right by 676 to my car, parked near the Inquirer's headquarters at 8th and Market. And I had my press pass displayed. I guess it wasn't prominent enough because at one point an officer said, hey, what are you doing out? There's a curfew. And I said, oh, I'm a reporter. And the officer said, oh, show me your badge. I showed it to him and he said, just make sure you put it a little more prominently. We don't want you to have any trouble. Okay, fine. I do that, continue my walk. When I get to City Hall, I saw some buses that were clearly there to take prisoners, people who had been arrested. And snapped a photo with my iPhone as we're doing now in this Twitter age.
Sure.
And then some police officers turned around and said, hey, you can't walk this way. And I said, okay, no problem. I turned around to kind of go another way, and then less than a minute later, some officers put my hands behind my back, kind of got me from behind, put both hands behind my back, and put handcuffs on my hands. And I said, I'm a reporter. I have a curfew exemption, sort of used my chin to indicate my press pass. And
it was hanging right there. It was clipped right to your shirt, right?
It could not have been in a more prominent position. It was
all right.
And they sort of acknowledged that they saw what I was doing, but it didn't make a difference to them. And so then they, put me on one of those buses, took my helmet off my head, I had my phone in one hand. They took my phone off. I was wearing a backpack, kind of my supplies. And they put my phone and my helmet inside my backpack, and then, put me and my backpack on the bus.
The bus sounded, from your account of it, there are some uncomfortable things happening. People were getting ill.
Yeah. So I mean, it was uncomfortable in that obviously I, was alarmed first and foremost that I was in police custody despite having done nothing wrong. And I was kind of the first person on the bus. The more people got on, everyone said they were there for a curfew violation. One woman, it was all women on my bus. They separated. There was a bus full of men and a bus full of women. One woman said she had been riding her bike and police basically forced her off her bike, forced her to just kind of drop her bike and put her on the bus. And so, we were all there for the same thing. But pretty quickly it got very heated. There were, people who, once the police were putting them on the bus, were, screaming epithets at them. And, so that was uncomfortable. I mean, obviously these were people who were, protesting police, and some people there's one woman who was crying when she was let on the bus. We were there for quite a while. It was a warm day. The bus, the windows opened just a crack, and most of them weren't open at all. And there was one woman who said she had asthma and started to have some respiratory distress. And by the time we got to the station for processing, she was kind of in a full-fledged asthma attack mode.
Oh, gosh.
I'm a mom of a kid with asthma, and so my heart is in my throat to begin with. And then I see this woman who's clearly in medical distress, and we're all saying, hey, she needs medical attention. She needs a medic. You need to get her off the bus. And it was several minutes before authorities got her off the bus, presumably to get some medical attention. So that was, it was probably the most disturbing thing I saw, that someone who was in such obvious physical distress. I mean, obviously she could have died. And then the other thing that happened that was kind of jarring was there was a woman who had to use the bathroom. She kept saying, I've got to pee, please, let me up. At this point, the bus was parked at a police station in North Philadelphia. And they said, basically told us right away, like, you're going to be processed, given a citation, you're going to, walk out tonight. It's not like we were going to be in a jail cell or taken anywhere past processing. So we were, physically at the building, but I guess there was so much going on there that they didn't have room to process us inside.
Yes.
A woman was saying, I have to go to the bathroom, and police were kind of ignoring her. And so probably after like 25 minutes, she's like, I'm just going to have to go to the bathroom on the bus. And so, she kind of, relieved herself. And, it was really sobering in many ways.
Yeah. You said in your article, I believe, that you did not personally witness any violence in the among the demonstrators. Am I correct?
So I personally saw no violence. Later in the day, the mayor and the police commissioner said that there were two acts that sort of spurred police to use tear gas. One was some protesters who threw rocks at police officers, and another was some protesters who kind of surrounded a state trooper in a car on 676 and rocked the car.
Yes.
Now, again, the crowd was thousands, so I certainly couldn't have seen everything. There was some pushback later. Did this really happen? But I did not see any violence. Obviously, there were businesses that were broken into and things that were stolen. None of this happened at the protest that I covered. That these were in separate events.
When you talk to demonstrators on the street, what was your impression generally of them? You said that they were largely young, although there was a diversity.
There was some. I mean, I saw a woman in a wheelchair, and I saw a guy pushing a baby stroller. So by and large, I would say the protesters were mostly in their 20s, but there was a diversity of age, certainly racially diverse. I would say on the bus of folks arrested, it was probably 50% people of color and 50% white people.
Interesting.
And so, it was a very diverse crowd.
Do you think, what was your impression of what they said about why they were there, their motivations, and were they there for the reasons that one would have thought watching the television, that they're there peacefully to take part in a national demonstration about police
Absolutely.
violence?
I mean, a lot of the people I talked to said they had never protested before. I mean, some people said they, had been in protests before to defund Wall Street, protest the Women's March, things like that. Various acts of the Trump administration. But I would say at least half of the people I talked to had not been to a protest before and said, they were just so moved by the death of George Floyd and the death of Ahmaud Arbery, the death of Breonna Taylor, really kind of motivated people to come out and to protest. Very passionately. There were, people who were weeping. There were people who were, visibly angry. People who just said they felt like, it was their duty to come out and protest.
Did you talk to people about how they were being seen out in the non-demonstrating world, or about the controversy or about the police? I'm just wondering about the tensions on the street.
In this particular protest, the protest where I got arrested, things were so fresh, and we were really just trying to, it wasn't that kind of story where we weren't doing, as much of a think piece. And
Sure.
so, we didn't talk about, how are you perceived in the larger world. I did cover protests subsequent to that.
Yeah.
And in particular, I talked to parents who brought young children to protests because, how is you, and this is obviously germane to me, how do you as a parent make that decision? You want to, tell your kid about the strange and scary things that are going on in the world, and how do you make the decision to bring them to a protest? And so, by and large, what people I talked to for that story said was, yeah, it's controversial, and there are some people who sort of equate us with looters and violence and things like that, but we want to be on the right side of history, and we feel like this is the right side of history, and so people were very motivated to be out there.
Let me ask you about the police, Kristen, since you had an up close and personal encounter with them. A lot of this has been about police violence against the protesters and against Black people. What was your take on the police and how they handled things?
So, I mean, I'd feel comfortable talking about my experience, what I saw, what I reported, what I experienced. I saw officers who were very polite and very helpful, and I also saw officers who obviously, disregarded the fact that I was lawfully allowed to be there. Put my hands behind my back, took my belongings away from me, and loaded me onto a paddy wagon. And so, obviously it's a mixed bag. There are people who are saying that tear gas was used, far too easily, that people who, may have screamed things at police, but didn't do anything to merit tear gas, got a face full of tear gas. I certainly saw kind of a mixed bag, a little bit of both.
So, Kristen, you mentioned talking to demonstrators who were parents who talked about talking to their kids about what they were doing and why they were demonstrating. Can you tell me how you personally have explained all of this? Not necessarily you're getting arrested, but the demonstrations to your children and what questions they had for you.
So I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and as you might expect, they had very different questions. I did talk to them about my arrest because there was the very basic first question was like, "Where's mom?" Because I was, said I was on my way home, and then I wasn't home, and suddenly, the editor's calling dad and saying mom's been arrested, and so I talked to them kind of in. My 7-year-old gets it a little more. I've told him about George Floyd and about Breonna Taylor and about other people who were killed by police. Sort of, obviously we have this narrative about, police are always helpers. And if you get lost, go to a police officer. And, I'm finding age appropriate ways to tell my kids that that's not true for everyone, that, mom's skin is white, and I feel safe. Most people, have the privilege of being treated well by police, but sometimes for Black and brown people, that's not always the case. And that, kind of talking about, their privilege and what their responsibility is to do, to help others and to point out racial injustice. In terms of the arrest, I just said, look, the police aren't always right. In this case, mom had her press pass. The law says I was allowed to be out there, and they arrested me anyway. Several days later, the mayor of Philadelphia did call me to apologize. And so kind of, said, and even the mayor said the police shouldn't have done what they did. So
very good.
Yeah, it's a continuing conversation.
What about the future? What do you think? You think this is going to continue through at least the summer?
I do. I think the protests, have gotten changed. We're seeing statues of racist Confederate folks come down. We're seeing, people take protesters' voices seriously and say, yeah, there is systemic bias, in policing. The defund the police movement, whatever you want to call it. We're seeing money in some places shifted away. Philadelphia, took away a planned increase for the police budget, and there's a move towards having fewer police in school and having more supportive services. And I think that's going to continue because this is not something that's going away. I mean, it wasn't just one unarmed Black person who was killed by police, and that drumbeat has continued. And I think this is a moment. This is a moment in history, and I think this is a movement that we're going to see continue.
Well, Kristen Graham, thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest and quite a story, and it's still going on as we speak. There are demonstrations today, and probably will continue, as you said. So thank you very much for giving us your perspective on them. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube. Our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. Musical Innertube, all one word, @gmail.com. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter @JTimPayne and @DonRooney9. And our webpage is Musical Innertube, that's musical spelled with 2 A's, MUSICAAL, Innertube, that's all one word, .libsyn, spelled LIBSYN.com. And the webpage will take you to all the other fine places that play the Innertube. Stitcher, SoundCloud. You can give us a review on iTunes. And if you want to go check out old episodes of the Musical Innertube, go to the Musical Innertube on YouTube. And thanks again to the virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing our theme music.